relationship between urban planning, architecture, and violence. Rioting, however, in the United States was not new. It also was not new to Detroit. This is, for example, an image of the year 1863, when there were huge race riots, both in New York. If you have all seen the film Gangs of New York, the Martin Scorsese film that played in the 19th century in New York, and the film ends with a magnificent but grim presentation of the riots, the draft riots in New York, and exactly at the same time also race riots broke out in the city of Detroit. But these riots, they were whites rioting against blacks and vice versa, so that there were two communities fighting each other on the streets with deadly results. The interesting thing is also that this riot, 1863, took place while the United States were at war, the Civil War. So Detroit, way up north, in the Yankee part of the United States, was at war with the Confederate States, who, over the issue of slavery and some other issues, fought the United States of the North, and the United States of the North ultimately won. So here the country was at war somewhere else, and inside the inner cities of the country another war broke out, the war between races, war between communities, war between classes. After the Civil War, what happened then was the industrialization of northern cities in the United States, the freeing of the slaves in the second half of the 19th century, but still the continuation of extremely racist rules and laws and also local habits, and the poverty, the rural poverty in the south of the United States, led to an enormous exodus of black people from the south to the north. Chicago, Detroit, New York were enormous attractors for this exodus of black workers. So who moved from the rural areas where they had worked on plantations, for example, and they moved up north to work in the steel plants, in the car factories, in the meat, in the butcheries of Chicago, and also they took with them this a black rural culture, which will come back later. So this enormous influx of black workers in the cities in the north, this enormous that went at an enormous pace all through the first half of the 20th century, created tensions. There was still segregation, for example, until the 1950s. Here, for example, you can see a housing project being built in the 1940s, late 30s, early 40s, I believe, in Detroit, especially for blacks. And this was exactly one of the places where another riot took place in 1942, the so-called Sojourner Truth riots, called after the name of this housing project, where it was also whites who attacked the blacks for coming into their city and coming into their neighborhoods, and they attacked the blacks in their own housing project. The army had to come in to calm down the riot. A year later, there were even bigger riots in the center of Detroit. I can't remember the name of these riots, where they were actually also, again, it was race rioting. So it was one community against the other, the whites against the blacks and vice versa. Here was a gigantic riot, lots of damage, an enormous disaster, and it also took 24 lives and destroyed an enormous amount of people. The Detroit riots that we are talking about today, in '67, caused 43 riots. So it was not a complete surprise, you could say. You see some of the images of the rioting in 1943. publication on it. Again, and this is something I have really, it's something that really asks for, I am no philosopher, no sociologist, but all the riots in the American inner city, nearly all the riots in the American inner cities happened when the country was at war. And I have no idea why that is. I mean, there are lots of easy, intuitive answers we could give. 1942, 1943, of course, the Second World War. 1863, the Civil War. 1967, the Vietnam War. So until now, all the major wars that this country was involved in also caused a kind of inner wars in the American inner cities. Anybody who can explain this gets a prize. So the city of Detroit, immediately after the Second World War, where there's something I have to tell you about the Second World War and its meaning for Detroit also. Detroit, we will come to that later, but I have to give it away a little bit now. The city of Detroit, of course, was specialized in car manufacture. It had the Ford factories, the General Motors factories, it had the Chrysler factories, and then the Second World War broke out, and America started producing, had to build an army. Not just its own army, but it also had to build tanks and warships and guns and airplanes for the British army. So, and all this happened in Detroit. All of a sudden, Detroit switched from consumer goods, like cars, to becoming the biggest manufacturer, or the only manufacturer nearly, of airplanes for the Second World War. Bombers were produced here, and they had to produce them faster than the Germans could shoot them down. So there was an enormous production of war material that led to an even faster growth of this city. It led to an immigration in 1 year of 300,000 people into a city of 1.5 million people. So the war, Detroit being called the arsenal of democracy, became an enormous power that blew up the size and the dynamics of the city. And of course also blew up the tensions between the racial groups. Now, this is an interesting example of how the city of Detroit tried to deal with the racial tension, because they thought, we can never have that again. We cannot allow ourselves to go through this disaster of race riots anymore. So this is a brochure. It reminds us a little bit of the kind of brochures that Dutch mayors are giving out in our cities, but then about how we should behave in the problem neighborhoods in Holland. But this one is a little bit more grim. It's how to lessen racial tension. So you have to give people better housing. You have to learn democratic behavior at school and in the church. There has to be firmness and understanding. So you have to be strict, but also honest and fair to your employees, to your black employees and your white employees at the same time. So there's a certain glimpse of equality, but not entirely. There has to be cooperation by press and radio, meaning that if there are riots, the press should not report on them, because then that would only inflame everything. There have to be citizen committees, so to kind of quell the tensions at the base, in the neighborhood. And there has to be a prompt action in all incidents, meaning that whenever somebody even thinks of looting, arrest them immediately. And of course, there has to be efficient policing of Negro districts. In Holland, they would say meer blauw op straat. Here it means, and the immediate availability of federal troops. So it's a strange combination of friendly, bottom-up community building and hardcore policing, even with federal troops. if you can imagine what that would mean, the immediate availability of federal troops, that would mean that every city would need its own barracks with the army present, and whenever there was a disturbance, the army should be able to immediately go in and start shooting back. So this was one of the lessons. These lessons weren't entirely drawn after the riots of 1942 and 1943. Another of the more grim lessons was that after the riots, the fear of the whites for the blacks was so great that the whites could only stay, or only wanted to stay, if there would be a wall between their neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods. And this is the so-called 8-mile wall. So this is a wall that, on one side of the wall you have white neighborhoods with good schools and nice houses and efficient public transport, etc. And on the other side the blacks were contained. This wall was built in also during the Second World War. It's obvious to see.
Does this wall help because if there is a riot, they can jump over the wall?
Yeah, and the wall. Well, of course, then if somebody sees somebody jumping over the wall, then they can call the police. That's the idea behind it. But of course, what the wall did was provoke such frustration and such anger that it became even worse in the near future. Now, so this riot of 1967 was not a complete or should not have been a complete surprise. However, with measures such as the ones I just showed you, this combination of better housing, better policing, better this, better that, the wall, etc. After the city officials, also the civil rights movement had been changing the country. So there was a sense in Detroit that they were one of those cities, because there had already been 2 or 3 years of rioting in other American cities and nothing had happened in Detroit. Detroit thought in the middle 60s, just before the riots, that they had one of the best urban policies, one of the most progressive urban policies, one of the most successful urban policies on inner city problems. They even had because they had been building the most highways, the most public housing, the most schools, etc. There had been no violence for since 23 or 25 years in the city. And so Detroit was seen to be a city that was way ahead in this solving of these huge problems of American intercities. Now, for example, this film is from 1966 or 1965, and it's a film called Detroit City on the Move, and it's a film, a beautiful film. You can see it completely on YouTube. It's a film made by the city of Detroit with its very modern, very ambitious mayor, Jerome Kavanagh, that who you see here introducing the film. And this film is a kind of a propaganda film for the city of Detroit and how incredibly modern and successful it is. It starts out with showing its completely modernized a central business district. Its center, bustling. It's like, you know, you have to remember, for people who know that series, this is the era of Mad Men. So it's this style of sleek, modernist towers, busy streets, extremely sophisticated American urban culture, highly modern, large-scale buildings. This is Cobo Hall on the river. New highways, enormous new highways, so you could zip from your suburban house straight into this enormously dense and urban and cosmopolitan urban center. And all this was the result of urban planning, which was then more or less discovered in America as a new thing. Thanks to urban planning, we can change the shape of our cities. We actually can control them. We can actually transform them from something that we do not like into something that we like. And in the transformation